Good morning. It's great to see everybody this morning. Good to see Sister Macy out this morning. Haven't seen you in a while. Sure is great to have you with us this morning. Good to see our visitors. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here. You don't know how much of an encouragement it is to me to see, especially when I go downstairs and teach a Bible class, to have a class full of kids. Or to see that we've got people up here that are in the worship service that are ready and wanting to serve God. And you wouldn't be here this morning if that wasn't what your intention was. And so I appreciate you being here because it is an encouragement to me. And I want you to know, just from the experience that I had this week, that people in the community are noticing the Caneyville Church of Christ. I had to go to the Cattlemen's Association meeting Thursday night in Butler County down at the Extension office. And I cannot tell you how many different farmers came up to me and said, "Man, I've been hearing a lot of good things coming out of that church that you're preaching at." And I said, "Well, it ain't because of me, I'll just tell you." And they said, "Well, I've heard of different people in the community talking about people that's been getting saved and people that are placing membership." And I said, "Yeah," I said, we're on a roll right now, and I hope we can keep that up. But I say that because there are people that have never stepped foot in this building that are talking about you and the things that you're doing. And so I appreciate that, and I appreciate the effort, and I appreciate those that have reached out to me to encourage me and my family and the work that we have here, because it is work. And I do appreciate that, because I want to do all that I can do to help this congregation grow and to keep the momentum that we have. And so I appreciate the encouragement and pray that we can keep it up. You know, as we go throughout our lives, we will constantly, we talked about this downstairs in our Bible class this morning, we're constantly going to be in an environment of where we are around people, it's just inherent, that do not have the same type of values that we have. Whether we have to work with them, or whether we have to go to school with them, or just associated with them as our neighbors, or whatever it might be, there are people this morning that do not have their mind set upon spiritual things. They this morning might be out fishing or turkey hunting or farming or getting ready for the ball game in a little bit, and have never at all this morning taken into consideration that this is the first day of the week. That it is the day that God has set aside for worshiping Him and studying Him and His Word. And we have to, as I've said it many, many times, we have to have the determination that there's no question that on this first day of the week, what we're going to be doing. That, yeah, I've got stuff I need to do in the shop. Yeah, Tennessee's playing today. But it don't make a difference. God comes first. Because I want to live in this world, but not be of this world. I want people that when they look at Caleb Smithson, that they know that there's no guess as to where Caleb's going to be on Sunday morning. Caleb's going to be right here, whether he's preaching or not. Caleb is going to be doing what was described in the New Testament as to serving God. Singing songs of praise His name. Or taking the Lord's Supper like we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That's what me and my household are going to do. I'm going to be of this world, but not, I'm going to be in this world, but not of this world. I'm going to be separated. I'm going to be separate from the rest of it. So, you know, and that's what He has told us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2. That's the point that He's trying to get across to the Israelites in Isaiah chapter 8 that Paul read to us. So the question that I want us to ask ourselves, and I want us to consider this morning, is how do we stand out in the crowd? In the midst of all the people that we work with, of all the people that we're associated with, how do I be different than the rest? How do I be different? Now, I know I'm a different guy. I know I am. I'd say that you'll be hard-pressed to find another guy that loves Civil War history, that loves sports like I do, that likes farming like I do, but also has watched every single Star Trek movie that there is. That's me. Live long and prosper. I know it. That's Caleb. I know I'm a different guy. I have a very broad range of interest. And I'm, to my fault, much like my dad in that aspect, that I've got a lot of different hobbies and I ain't good at none of them. But that's just me. But how do I stand out from the rest of the population instead of just being different in that aspect? You know, there are people that I can work with, I can be associated with. I know a lot of people across the state of Kentucky, across the United States. How can I stand out? How can you stand out different from them? So that then when they look at you and say, hey, that person is living their life different. What are they doing different that makes them different? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some examples of that. You know, if you were here a couple of Wednesday nights ago, I told you I was going to do a sermon kind of about this. And I talked about Philip. And if you read the thing on Facebook this morning, I kind of did a beginning summary of this. But Philip the evangelist that we see in Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 7 is one that has always stood out to me, of one that stood out in the crowd. If you would turn over there with me in the book of Acts chapter 8. Now the Acts chapter 8 is known to many for being the for being the passage that talks about the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch in the latter part of the chapter. And it definitely, Philip does do good through doing that. But the story of Philip before that, and chapter 7 and chapter 8, really tells the story of who this man, Philip, actually was. When we look at who Philip is, in Acts chapter 6, it says in Acts chapter 6 and verse 3, it says, "Therefore, brethren, select from among you 7 good men of reputation, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task." And in verse 5, we see Philip being one of those that's selected. Now, in chapter 8, we see Saul, who later becomes the Apostle Paul, is beginning his persecution of the church. And it says there in chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, "Saul was in hearty agreement in putting him to death," talking about Stephen. "And on that day, a great persecution began against the church, and they were scattered all throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over him. But Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house, and dragging off men and women he would put in prison." So because of what Saul's doing, these Christians are being dispersed out throughout Judea and through Samaria. Now, what do we know about the Samaritans? Well, we know that Jews and Samaritans didn't really get along, right? It'd been like that for years. But we see in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, it says, "Therefore those who have been scattered went about preaching the word." Philip's one of these ones that scattered. And in verse 5 it says, "He went down to the city of Samaria and began proclaiming Christ to them." So he, like many other Christians, are scattered. But what he does is he goes and says, hey, here's a group of people that have not heard the good news. They had not heard the gospel. So what am I going to do? I'm going to teach them. And we see in Acts chapter 8 and verse 12 that because of Philip's efforts, in Acts chapter 8 and verse 12, it says that they believed Philip preaching the good news about the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ. They were being baptized, men and women alike. Philip was being successful in what he was doing, right? Now, that in itself is not different than some of the things that the apostles have been doing. Peter had great success at the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, right? That in itself, although great, didn't necessarily make him stand out. What makes him stand out to me is what we see in the beginning of Acts chapter 8 and verse 26. or we'll just start in verse 25. It says, when they had solemnly testified and spoken the word of the Lord, they started back to Jerusalem and began teaching the gospel in many of the villages of the Samaritans. But the angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, saying, get up and go south to the road that descends from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert or deserted road. Now, we know from Acts chapter 8 and verse 14, and what we read earlier, that there were apostles in Jerusalem. Now, an apostle could do signs, wonders, and seen Jesus, right? Paul, Peter, Andrew, they're all apostles. And so he is in this same vicinity as to what these other men are. But out of all the Christians that are in that area, who does God choose to go teach to this man out that's on a deserted road? He picks Philip. He picks Philip. So when I read that gives me chill bumps, honestly, thinking about that. How can I be a Philip? That I'm doing so much for the kingdom, that I'm doing so much for his cause, like Philip was in Acts chapter 8 and verse 12, and teaching and preaching and baptizing, that God says, you know, there's a man that's traveling to a part of the world that, to our knowledge, the gospel's not been taught yet, the Ethiopian eunuch. I'm going to send this man to be the one that teaches him. Because I know through his teaching, he's going to be the one that is going to be able to help to spread the gospel throughout the world. How can I be a Philip? Now, when we think about Philip, we read later in the book of Acts, he's just like me and he's just like you. Philip has a family. It mentions that Philip has daughters. I've got daughters. But when Philip was asked by God to get up and go to a deserted road to teach this man, Philip didn't say, oh, now hold on now. There's a game at 1:30 I cannot miss. I've got to be at work tomorrow. What are you talking about? I mean, the apostles, Jesus picked them. He told them to go all out into the world and preach the gospel. I got to be at work tomorrow. I've got other things that are pressing in my life. I've done my dues in Samaria. Look at what I've done in Samaria in the past. He ain't talking about the past. He's talking about right now. What can you do now? And he saw Philip and he said, hey, I want you to go teach this man. Yes, I know that there's other people in the area that can do the job, but I'm talking to you. What can you do for me, Philip? Philip stood out in the crowd. Philip was in this world, but he wasn't of this world. Philip was doing so much for the kingdom that God picked him out of everybody else. How can Caleb be a Philip? How can Caleb do what I need to do to help this church grow? To help the kingdom grow? Philip ain't no different than me. Philip had flaws just like me. Philip had a family just like me. He had to provide for his family just the same as I've got to provide for my family. But when God looked at him, God said, that's who I'm sending. You're the man for the job. And Philip got up and went. And we know the rest of the story, what happens in Acts chapter 8. He goes and teaches the Ethiopian eunuch. And because of his teaching, of the simple teaching that Philip had to him about who Jesus was, that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the anointed one, and that Jesus did come to do what was prophesied in the book of Isaiah. And then the Ethiopian eunuch said, well, here's water. What prevents me from being baptized? And what does Philip do? He baptizes him. Philip wouldn't have been able to baptize him if he wasn't standing out in the crowd, because God wouldn't have picked him. But because he was different, because he was making a difference in the kingdom, God said, hey, I'm going to send Philip. Yeah, I know Peter's in Jerusalem, but Philip's been doing work for me in the kingdom, and because of that, I'm going to send Philip. How can you be a Philip? How can I be a Philip? It applies to me just as it does to anybody. Remember what I told y'all last week? I'm a work in progress, and I'm far from being a Philip. But all I can do is get up every single day and try my best to keep on keeping on to try to be a Philip, to stand out of the crowd, to be in the world but not of the world. What can I do to be a Philip? Another person that stands out to me in the Old Testament is David. Flip over with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16, this is actually where we are introduced to David. In chapter 16, we see Samuel being sent to Bethlehem. And it says, Now the Lord said to Samuel, How long will you grieve over Saul? Since I have rejected him and from being king over Israel, fill your horn with oil and go. And I will send to you Jesse, the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons. But Samuel said, How can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, Take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. You shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, Do you come in peace? He said, I come in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When he entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, Do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, but man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, The Lord has not chosen this one either. Next Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, The Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, The Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, Are these all the children? And he said, There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep. Then Samuel said to Jesse, Send and bring him here, for we will not sit down until he comes here. Then he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Now, I'm the oldest child, actually, of my dad. I've got 3 other siblings. Y'all knew Jed from Jed attending here. He was the baby. I got Jacob, she's a year younger than me, and I got a sister. So I'll never know what it's like to experience being the baby of the family. But David could. When Samuel comes to anoint, it says he had all these sons. Jesse don't even think about bringing David to Samuel. That in his eyes he was insignificant. Don't worry about him. He's just watching the sheep. I've got who you want right here. And I don't know what his older brother looked like, but apparently he was pretty formidable. God tells him, he said, don't be looking at how tall he is, how big of a boy he is. He's not who I've chosen. What does God tell Samuel? He says, I don't look at the outward. I look at the inward. That's who I'm worried about. Samuel says, bring him. We're not going to do anything until he's here. Immediately, when David shows up, what does he say to him? There he is. Anoint him. I'm here to tell you, you might consider yourself insignificant in the kingdom of God. You might think that people think that you're insignificant. You might think, hey, I'm like Moses. I can't speak. I'm not one that's going to be a good teacher. I don't have that ability. God said, I don't look at the outward, I look at the inward. You might say, hey, I've not been a Christian all that long. I can't do what brother or sister so-and-so can do. I'm insignificant. God said, I don't look at the outward, I look at the inward. Common sense for an Israelite would have said, hey, we're going to pick the oldest. The birthright. What did he do? He picks the least likely out of all of them. And David, although a young boy, in the example we see here in 1 Samuel chapter 16, becomes a man that is known as a man after God's own heart. Seems pretty significant to me. Because out of all his brothers, he stood out in the crowd. That even though he was the one that was assigned to watching the sheep, that's all he can do. He ain't got to be here. Don't worry about him, Samuel. Matter of fact, I even forgot he's out there. But David, from a young boy, stands out from the crowd. And because of that, God said, when he walked up, he said, for this is he. Don't count yourself out. Don't say because of your own thoughts of what I can do for the kingdom. Think about David. That even though you might think you're insignificant, God has a plan for you, and God can make you into the Christian that you can be and should be, and to be able to serve him standing out in the crowd. I also think about another man. You ever thought about Noah? You want to talk about standing out in a crowd? Noah is the epitome of standing out in a crowd. When you read Genesis chapter 6, and I'll use this as an opportunity to plug the Wednesday night Bible class, it's going to be a really good class. I promise you, I have spent, you can ask Amelia, I have spent hours, days, preparing the information for the book that I gave y'all, which is 40-something pages. Mine's about 200 and something. I promise you, we will not get through lesson number 1 in the first class. If we do, I'm doing something wrong, because there's so much to be packed into it. And so if you can be there on Wednesday night, be there. I don't want my work to be for nothing, and I think that we will all get a lot out of it. So I will say that. And if you need more books, I can print more. Plenty of paper. Don't worry about it. So be there if you can be there. But what we learned in the book of Genesis, which is what we're going to start on Wednesday night, when sin had entered the world in Genesis chapter 3, things by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6 have gotten really, 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 really bad. So much that it says in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5, it says, and the Lord saw the wickedness that the man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had even made man, and he was grieved in the heart. He said, I will blot man whom I've created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to birds to the sky, for I am sorry that I've made him. God had had enough. For what had started out perfect in the Garden of Eden and the beautiful this sanctuary that was Eden, man had ruined it by introducing sin. And because of that, God had to remove himself from the garden and from man, because God and sin cannot coexist. We see in Genesis chapter 4, Cain kills Abel, the continuation of sin. We see Cain's descendants continuing in sin. We see them multiplying and intermarrying with the sons of Seth. So much that by this point God said, I'm done with it. You ever been like that? I've had enough of it. I cannot take it no more. That's how God was. But in verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 5, wickedness was so great on the earth. But Noah found favor. Now, when you take into consideration, and we'll talk about this when we get to Genesis chapter 6 in our Bible class here in a few weeks, but when you take into consideration the length of how long people lived back through the biblical record, and how many years that they had to have children because of that and multiplying and things like that, there are estimates, and I'm not going to claim to know, because we don't have no way of knowing this, but there are estimates that the population of the earth could have been very similar to what we have today. Think about that. Now, let's just say for argument's sake that it was. And just for argument's sake. How many people do we have on the earth today? 8 billion, I think. They're saying I remember from an article I read, I think by 2050, which is only 25 years away, they're saying that we could have 10 billion people on this earth. Like I said, just for argument's sake. But imagine you are Noah. And that everything has gotten so bad that the only people that are found favor in this world is you, your wife, your youngins, and their wives. That's pretty bad. And God has gotten so upset of the actions that he says, I'm done. I'm done with a capital D. I'm going to start over. I'm going to blot them out. But there's one person that stands out in the crowd, and this is this feller named Noah. You talk about being in the world but not of the world. That man right there. And because of Noah's faithfulness, God decides that, hey, through Noah, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. There's going to be a worldwide flood. And even though you've never seen rain before, hey, by the way, it's going to rain. I'm going to have you build an ark big enough that one day they're going to build an attraction over it in northern Kentucky. It's going to be so big that you can put every single living animal on it, plus food, and you're going to float across the world so that even there's going to be so much water that even the tops of the mountains are going to be covered. Oh, and by the way, everybody else is going to die. And because of this, when you do come off this ark, I'm going to establish a new covenant with you. You talk about standing out in a crowd. God's saying to Noah, you're the man. Because you live for me, I'm going to spare you. You stood out in a crowd. So the question we have to ask ourselves, and this is only a question that only you can answer, but can you sit there with certainty this morning and say, yes, Caleb, yes, whoever, I am doing my best to live a life that's where I stand out of the crowd. Now, I'm going to tell you, I make mistakes every single day. Every single day. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. I know I'm not. You ain't neither. But all we can do is trying to keep on every single day. So that when God calls and says, hey, there's a neighbor down the road that needs to be taught, God has enough faith in me to know that I know the Scriptures. I can give a defense for what I believe, and I can lead that person to Christ. I can be a Philip. Or that when God looks for someone to be a leader in the church, like He looked at David to be a leader of the Israelites, that He can say, hey, I know someone. They live around Caneyville. They stand out to me. Or that when God looks at this earth of the wickedness that we have in the United States, that God can look and say, hey, things might be bad, but I know that there are Christians in Caneyville that still stand upon the Word. We pray about that, don't we, Tracy? Are we living the life that would back that up? Now, only you can answer that. Only I can answer it for myself. But the only way that we can begin, and it is the only way, that we can begin to have a life where we're standing out, is if we are a born-again Christian. By coming to Jesus through baptism and saying, hey, I don't want to be like the rest of the world anymore. I want to live for Jesus. I want to be different. I want to stand out. So that when God comes with His angels to cast judgment on the world, that I'm going to stand out. I'm not going to go with the rest of the world that goes towards a punishment, because I'm here to tell you that's where most are going. Because most do not care about spiritual things. But if I'm going to stand out from the crowd, and I've made the decision that I am going to live for Jesus, that I am going to live for Christ, that I am going to come to Him through baptism, by coming to Him and repenting, and truly repenting, not just saying it, but stop doing what we had been doing and begin living for Jesus. And then confessing that He is who He says He is, and then being buried in a watery grave of baptism like we've had the privilege of seeing the past 2 weeks. And then remaining faithful until our death. So that when we die, God can say, hey, he or she, they stood out in the crowd, entering into the blessings of the reward. Maybe you're here this morning and you haven't been standing out in the crowd. Maybe you've allowed the influence of the world to affect you. There is absolutely no reason any of us leave here this morning not ready for the Lord to come back and not standing out in the crowd. If there's any need for salvation this morning, come forward as we stand and sing the song, Been Selected.